Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya. Good morning, Adefemi. Oh, it looks so bright and sunny in that background in London. Good morning.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Dr. Rubin. It is bright and sunny. London, I always say the sun here is a little fake. It might be light, it might be bright, but it might not be warm. And today is not too warm, but the weather is definitely of spring, approaching the Easter season, so we do know that the weather will be picking up. So thankfully, very, very bright days ahead. Good morning, Vimbai, and good morning to Rufai. I hope you're all doing well. Let me tell you what is happening around the world. Let's start in the United States, where we do know that US President Donald Trump has unveiled a minimum package of tariffs around 10% for countries, and that jumps up to 20% depending on what country you're looking at. Now, it was been dubbed Liberation Day. Donald Trump had a huge poster which had a list of countries which he dubbed, reciprocal tariffs, what countries were going to be slapping or had already slapped tariffs on the United States, and what the US were going to do in response to that. So at the top of that list was, of course, China, and they had a tariffs of around 34%, and then that was immediately followed by the European Union with this 20% tariff situation. And that is something that triggered, of course, a response from Ursula von der Leyen, who is the EU Commission chief, the head of the EU Commission. And she talked ultimately about her disappointment in this decision coming from the White House, coming from Donald Trump. She talked about how over the years, for 80 years, for example, the United States and the European Union have enjoyed a mutually beneficial relationship when it comes to the economy. They've enjoyed trade amongst each other that has created jobs, that has created prosperity. So ultimately, this is a feeling of disappointment, seeing these harsh penalties slapped on the European Union. But in response, her words were quite strong. She did say that they were preparing a package of responses, and it will be interesting to see what those look like. In the aftermath of this news of tariffs being slapped on the European Union, they will continue to prepare another set of retaliatory actions if negotiations fail. Now, it will be very interesting again to see what these negotiations will look like, especially since the European Union would be negotiating with President Trump, who sees the world very black and white when it comes to many things, especially when we're looking at what his definitions are of America first. There's very little space for nuance and for negotiation. But that being said, still preempting what these negotiations will look like, this is a person who clearly is treating the country like a business, so will not be a stranger to negotiations, but it will be interesting to see what will be the result of that, especially since so many countries in the world are reeling from this news and are not happy, notably Japan, of course, being slapped with these tariffs and their response, and also China, which is clearly going to be the hardest hit by it. We already know that they are slapping retaliatory tariffs back onto the United States. So very, very much a trade war as it stands. Now, one country that could be breathing a sigh of relief is the United Kingdom. Keir Starmer, when we talked about the newspaper review yesterday, we did discuss how, Kemi Badenoch had told him to be careful and that he shouldn't preempt or trigger a trade war with the United States that could leave the United Kingdom being worse off. But ultimately, it looks like the United Kingdom kind of got away with a slap on the wrist, just 10%. So I think that could be a result of Keir Starmer's charm offensive working on the United States. You do know that he visited Donald Trump at the White House a few weeks ago, and during that visit, he gave a letter to Donald Trump from King Charles inviting visit, allowing the two to meet in June. So perhaps that could be an example of, not too much of a tough relationship between the two sides. That being said, still this 10% tariff is going to be quite significant, is going to form some form of a threat to the UK economy, especially at a time like this. So I know that definitely there are some voices at number 10 Downing Street, some economic voices here in the United Kingdom that are not happy with this 10%. But as we look at the other countries and how other countries have fared in the aftermath of the so-called Liberation Day from Donald Trump, it does seem as though the United Kingdom seems to have skated away a little lightly. Now, moving on now to mainland Europe, and it is being confirmed that on today, Thursday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will make a trip to Hungary. Now, this is significant because if you remember, the International Criminal Court did slap an arrest warrant, an international arrest warrant on Benjamin Netanyahu for his participation in crimes against humanity, war crimes. And so essentially, if he leaves the country, if he leaves Israel and goes to a country that is a signatory to the ICC, there is an expectation that authorities in said country would hand Netanyahu over to the International Criminal Court. But significantly, what we are seeing is that the leader of Hungary, Viktor Orban, says he's going to do just the opposite of that and has welcomed Benjamin Netanyahu essentially with very open arms. It's very unlikely that he will turn him over to the authorities. Now, this is going to be interesting because Hungary is a signatory to the International Criminal Court. It has been so for years. And so even when this ruling came down in November, it was expected that some countries were not going to participate. The United Kingdom, for example, did say that if Benjamin Netanyahu did travel to its country, it would hand him over, he would be apprehended and handed over to the International Criminal Court. Clearly, that's not something that Viktor Orban is going to do in Hungary, but it will be interesting because, as I said, they are still a signatory. And in the aftermath of that, it could be expected that during this visit of Benjamin Netanyahu in Hungary, you could see Viktor Orban announce Hungary's departure from the ICC. Again, another example of perhaps the countries around the world, more far right-leaning countries, especially in Europe, turning a bit more insular, becoming a bit more isolated from, the world order or different international institutions as it stands here. But those are your stories from across the world. Love to hear your thoughts before we move on to the papers.
It was Liberation Day for a fool's paradise yesterday. It was Liberation Day for world chaos. Femi, Trump went ahead and he started tariffing everybody. In fact, he even tariffed a certain small island in the Antarctica called McDonald Island, where, guess what lived in? Penguins. A lot of penguins live there. I'm sure penguins, too, are fighting America in trade, and the Heard Islands and many other inhabited islands around the world that he also tariffed yesterday. We know how this will end. It will end in disaster. Ursula von der Leyen has responded. Many world leaders have responded. The markets fell yesterday. All the markets were in red territory yesterday because of this. Even the futures market didn't do any better. Gold soared. And anytime gold increases in price, a bellwether for the fact that things are not right in the world economy because people take refuge in gold. Went up to 3,160 yesterday, USD. And that's how chaotic what Trump has done. But see, I have gone through the historical analysis of tariff, from the 1861 Morrill tariff to the McKinley tariff to the Smoot-Hawley tariff to the Payne-Aldrich tariff. It goes on and on like that. All of this tariff has something in common. It's an attempt to favor the rich. It makes America poorer. The people will kick against it. Price of commodity will increase. And in the end, when a sensible government comes in, they'll remove those tariffs. Just exactly what happened to the McKinley tariff in the early, I think 1890. He was later to become the American president, McKinley then, but then he was in the House and he pushed forward this McKinley tariff. What happened afterwards? He lost in the midterm elections because people were irate. Anyway, he went ahead to be Ohio governor and went ahead to be president. If you go back historically, 1840s, the Corn Laws, how Britain too felt it was going to stabilize its economy after the Napoleonic Wars. What happened? The Corn Laws led to the birth of the Economist magazine and the likes of advocates for free trade like Ricardo, like Walter Bagehot. It doesn't work. And the papers are out yesterday, the analyses are out. It's going to put America's economy in dire straits. Real quickly, as I wrap up, I'm not surprised. Right-wing nationalists like Viktor Orban, too, will support the atrocities going on in Israel because of his correspondence with America. So I'm not surprised. But isn't it shocking that many years after, the same Jewish people we fought for are now the ones perpetrating injustice against other people? And the same Adolf Hitler that was the problem. Netanyahu is fast becoming another Hitler. But I'm not surprised. That's urban. They will all coalesce. But hegemony will never last forever.
Right. Truly, hegemony will never last forever. Looking at global responses to the tariffs, I want to bring the conversation home because, of course, we see that Nigeria was hit with 14% tariffs. South Africa was hit with 30%. Ghana was hit with, I believe, 29%. It officially or unofficially marks the end of AGOA. What does this mean for Africa? What does this mean for African countries that are trading with the United States? If you look at Nigeria, for example, it means that it will become more complex for Nigeria to trade outside of crude oil with the United States, as of course, the whole idea around this is to make foreign products less favorable to Americans. Now, this goes back to a philosopher I thoroughly enjoyed in school, Jeremy Bentham, who came up with the philosophy around utilitarianism. And for him, he believed that all choices should be done, everything should be done to accommodate the greatest good. However, even those in the Republican Party, even staunch supporters of Donald Trump, are calling this an experiment because it could either go very well for the American economy, create much needed jobs, stimulate industry, or it could spell havoc. It could spell hyperinflation, a mega recession. We don't know which way it'll go. That's the honest truth. This is an experiment. Yes, historical precedent is mixed because tariffs have had mixed fortunes in many countries. However, most countries that have imposed tariffs are not as developed and as far down the developmental line as the United States is, and they're not at the center of the world to the degree that the United States is. So it's going to be a very bumpy few months, especially for us here on the African continent, who will now need to strategize around what we can officially call the end of AGOA, that preferential agreement that allowed us to trade largely duty-free with the United States. 14% is heavy. 14% is very heavy. So those are the aspects I want to focus on when we are looking at Trump and the tariffs.
Okay, very quickly, President Trump said, yesterday was Liberation Day, and that this is an attempt to put America first. And he was carrying a chart in the Rose Garden, having signed an executive order, but he wasn't playing Rose Garden politics. What he has done is just to upend the International World Trade Order, the worst that we have seen since the end of the World War II. And analysts are looking at what will be the likely impact. Now, the point has been made that this is likely to affect growth in the United States itself. This is likely to drive up inflation. And this is also not likely to create domestic jobs that Trump says he's looking at. And the main reference is the tariffs in 1930, the Smoot-Hawley, tariffs, which in fact, according to the experts, contributed to the Great Depression in the 1930s in the United States. But the bigger impact is on the global scale. Now, you were talking about the reactions of the countries. They were divided into three categories. 10% for baseline countries, those that are not the great offenders, like UK, like Australia, some other countries, Colombia, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, those ones 10%. And the UK say, oh, well, this is an effort on the part of the UK to engage the United States. In fact, Daily Express says, oh, this is because it's Brexit Britain, because the EU countries are getting 20%. Now, if the second category of countries are countries that are considered the worst offenders, about 60 of them, so they are going to get reciprocal tariffs of different categories. China, for example, is going to get 54% total. South Africa, 30%. All the EU countries are 20%. Now, the chart that Trump was carrying, well, if you look at tariffs from the EU against U.S. imports, is 29%. Now, Trump says, well, he's very flexible. He has given them 20%. China, actually, cumulatively, is 67%. The U.S. is imposing 50%. The third category are the countries, Canada and Mexico. They are not getting any tariffs. They already have tariffs, of course, that will come into effect today. 25% on automobiles, and also existing tariffs on steel and aluminum. So those are the three categories, with the threat that more tariffs will come. Now, UK says we are not going to engage in any trade war. We'll engage in, further dialogue with the US to see if we can work out a deal. The Russians say, well, they are going to retaliate, that they too will fight back. The EU, von der Leyen, is now saying that the tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs on their side that were suspended, would now be introduced mid-April. Canada, Mark Carney, says that they too will fight back. Australia says this is not the act of a friend. But markets, and corporations didn't do well after that announcement. That is the way the world is reacting. But nobody knows how this will end. But the bigger threat is to international trade. Now, quickly, to Netanyahu going to Hungary. Well, Viktor Orban, everybody knows, does not support the International Criminal Court, which was created by the Rome Statute. And that body has been heavily criticized. So Viktor Orban, who is a Trump fan, known for his dictatorship, let me use that easy phrase, is now supporting an ally, Israel. And so that's consistent in terms of the kind of politics that he plays. In fact, Hungary has been threatening to even pull out of the ICC. All the 27 EU countries are members of the ICC, and they are under obligation to respect the ruling of the ICC. And the ICC has placed an arrest warrant on Netanyahu. But Netanyahu is now going to Hungary for 4 days to show that he's a statesman and that he's above international law. He has the support of the United States, which in February, in fact, placed sanctions on members of the International Criminal Court. The big question that this raises is about the effectiveness, the value, the continued relevance of the structures of the United Nations to keep peace and to establish international law properly as a compass for guiding relations among states and also by corporations and human beings. Now, this is not the first time. Putin also got an arrest warrant, I think last September 2024. But Putin went to Mongolia, which is also a signatory to the Rome Treaty, and he spent days there and he went back. Yes. Nothing happened. He was not arrested. So these are the issues. The international order being defeated in terms of trade and also in terms of international law. And Trump is at the center in both regards.
In all ways. So thank you very much, all of you. Thank you to all of you for your analysis. Very quickly, let's run through some Nigerian papers. I know we're running out of time, but I would like to tell you what's happening on the front covers of our nation's papers. Let's begin, of course, with the front page of This Day this morning. Bank's approval of this $1.08 billion line of funding for the operations in Nigeria. These are 3 separate operations that are focused on education, on nutrition, and on economic resilience. So very interesting times ahead when it comes to how this money is going to be used. We talked about another line of funding yesterday and Nigeria's debt profile. So separately from this new money coming in, it will be interesting to see how it's going to be divvied up and whether or not this will be done so efficiently. Moving on to the new Telegraph this morning, we do have reports of Nigerians, just to touch on what we were already discussing in terms of these international tariffs that the US has triggered and what effect they may or may not have on countries like Nigeria. The new Telegraph looks at how Nigerians spent some 1.05 trillion naira in 2024 on the import of used vehicles from the United States. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to hear what the responses will be to that on both ends. Moving on to the Daily Independent, however, this morning, it does have the Sultan of Sokoto, Alhaji Mohammed Saad Abubakar, urging governors across Nigeria to treat other Nigerians residing states as indigents, especially at a time of ethnic-based violence or violence in general that we're seeing across the country. And, an example of that violence is shown on the front page of the Daily Trust this morning, as notorious bandit Kachala Bello Turji is accused of killing 11 more people, 11 farmers, also in Sokoto State, just to underscore what the Sultan of Sokoto had said. And then moving on to the Daily Sun, as well as the reasons why, especially the Punch, they do look at the reasons why, according to sources, President Tinubu sacked Mele Kyari at the helm of the NNPCL and replaced him with Bayo Ojulari, which is definitely a move that has been welcomed by many nevertheless. And then we are discussing politics finally on the front page of The Punch this morning as Asue Ighodalo heads to appeal court following the affirmation of Monday Okpebolo's victory as governor of Edo State. Those are your papers from Nigeria.
All right, Adefemi, unfortunately our time is fast spent, but thank you so much for giving us this great analysis of everything from international to local. I hope you enjoy sunny but chilly London.